He is on to his 7th Prime Minister since 2017. We told you about the government collapse yesterday. The current Prime Minister resigned. Today, there's a new man in the hot seat. His name is Sébastien Lecornu. He is 39 years old. He's a Macron loyalist, and his arrival could not have been more unpleasant. So why is France burning? How did we get here? And what happens next? First, let's look at the protests in the country. France's streets turn into battlegrounds today. From Paris to the south of France, the protests are led by a decentralized movement. It is called Let's Block Everything.
For over a century, Africa has been seen as the world's supplier, a continent rich in materials, but locked out of global value creation. That era is ending. In 2025, under the banner of the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, more than 50 African nations united to form a single coordinated economic platform, a market representing 1.4 billion people and a combined GDP of nearly $4 trillion. But that was only the beginning. The turning point came when AfCFTA partnered with the Asia-Africa Economic Corridor Initiative, connecting African industrial hubs with Asian production networks through ports, rail lines, and digital payment systems. The resulting web of trade agreements, resource-sharing pacts, and technology transfer deals now exceeds $25 trillion in projected value. For the first time, African countries are not just exporting commodities. They are exporting finished products, digital infrastructure, and intellectual property. Nigeria's oil refineries, rebuilt with Asian investment, are processing crude locally and exporting petrochemicals directly. South Africa is assembling battery components for electric vehicles using Congolese cobalt and Zambian copper. Kenya's tech industry, linked to India's software hubs, is powering Africa's new digital finance networks. And Morocco has emerged as a green energy leader, exporting solar power across the Mediterranean. The result is an Africa that controls every stage of the value chain, from raw material to finished export. Economists call it the second industrial revolution of the global south. And unlike the industrial booms of the past, this one is built on fairness, not extraction. African policymakers are now using a continental pricing mechanism, pegging commodities not to the dollar or euro, but to a new regional trade unit supported by gold and resource-backed reserves. This shift is subtle but seismic. It weakens European leverage over African trade, while stabilizing intra-African markets. The deal also integrates major infrastructure programs. The Lagos-Nairobi Economic Corridor for Industrial Logistics, the Abidjan-Djibouti Maritime Route for faster global shipping, and the Trans-Saharan Energy Grid, linking solar power plants across 10 nations. Behind this transformation is one unifying goal: to ensure that Africa's wealth circulates within Africa first. For decades, European corporations extracted $200 billion annually from African economies through unequal contracts and currency manipulation. Now, those same resources are generating local manufacturing, jobs, and digital innovation. The AfCFTA Secretariat estimates that by 2030, intra-African trade will rise by over 80%, while exports to Western countries will gradually decline. This means more independence and far less vulnerability to foreign sanctions or trade coercion. But this revolution didn't happen in isolation. It's part of a wider geoeconomic realignment, one that places Africa at the center of global trade, not at its margins. The world's largest economies, China, India, Japan, and the Gulf states, have all signed on to this framework, offering investment, infrastructure, and joint ventures. They see Africa not as a charity case, but as the future of global growth. Meanwhile, in Europe, policymakers are panicking. Their supply lines are being rerouted, their contracts are expiring, and their influence is shrinking. And no European nation stands to lose more than France, the one that once dominated Africa's economic destiny. As the new African trade system expands, France's old networks begin to unravel, from energy imports to monetary control. For Paris, what was once an invisible advantage is turning into an economic emergency. For decades, France quietly maintained one of the most complex and controversial economic systems in the modern world. The franc zone, a web of 14 African countries using the CFA franc, a currency tied directly to the French treasury. It allowed Paris to control monetary policy, profit from reserves, and secure cheap access to raw materials from Africa: gold, oil, uranium, cocoa, and gas. This system guaranteed France both economic stability and global influence, even as its domestic industry struggled. But the $25 trillion Africa-Asia Trade Pact changed everything. When African nations announced they would denominate trade in local and continental currencies, bypassing the CFA and even the euro, France's leverage began to collapse almost overnight. By mid-2025, reports from the French Ministry of Economy showed a sharp 38% decline in African imports, a 42% drop in access to critical minerals, and an unprecedented energy deficit caused by reduced African oil and gas supplies. French companies like Total Energies, Areva, and Ballor saw their long-standing contracts either renegotiated or canceled outright. The African narrative had changed. We will no longer export poverty. We will export power. For the first time since World War II, France's financial elite were unable to influence Africa's central banks. Countries like Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, and Cameroon, once fully integrated into the French system, began transitioning to new continental payment systems built on blockchain networks co-developed with Asian tech partners. This shift caused immediate turbulence in Paris. Without Africa's reserves backing the Eurozone, France's bond market weakened. The euro slipped against the dollar and yuan, and French inflation hit a 40-year high. To many economists, it looked like the collapse of France's hidden empire, a system of economic control disguised as partnership. Yet in Africa, this wasn't chaos. It was liberation. Central banks across West Africa began reclaiming monetary sovereignty. New trade zones replaced the CFA with digital settlement systems backed by commodities like gold, cobalt, and lithium, resources Africa controls in abundance. By mid-year, over 60% of intra-African trade was settled without any Western currency. This shift undermined decades of dependency and symbolized something far greater: the end of France's post-colonial economic model. In Paris, the effects were visible. Energy prices soared. Factory output declined. Protests erupted as industrial workers, especially in the automotive and chemical sectors, faced mass layoffs. France's GDP contracted by 2.7% in one quarter, the steepest decline since the COVID-19 pandemic. And as the African market, once worth billions in exports for French goods, shifted toward Asia, France found itself isolated. French media outlets began asking the unthinkable: had Africa, once the cornerstone of French foreign policy, now become its undoing? Inside the Élysée Palace, the crisis sparked division. Some advisors urged negotiation, offering new investment deals to re-engage African partners. Others pushed for confrontation, warning that France's strategic interests in uranium, particularly from Niger, were under threat. But African nations were no longer responding to pressure. When France tried to intervene diplomatically in Niger and Gabon, both nations recently strengthening trade ties with China and Russia, the response from African leaders was united and firm. Africa will decide Africa's future. In a single year, France lost not only its supply contracts, but also its geopolitical influence, something it had spent decades building through soft power, military bases, and diplomacy. France's economic struggles sent shockwaves through Europe. Without cheap African resources, industries in Germany, Italy, and Spain began facing higher costs, while European investors scrambled to secure new sources in Latin America and Asia. But these alternatives came with higher logistics costs and lower margins. It became clear that Europe had underestimated Africa's economic leverage, and now it was paying the price. Across EU summits, analysts spoke of a strategic rebalancing, code for the loss of European dominance in African markets. Africa was no longer a supplier. It was a partner, setting the terms of engagement. And while Europe was still trying to adapt, another power had already stepped in to support Africa's transformation: Asia. As Europe scrambles to recover, the Asia-Africa alliance takes shape, linking ports, industries, and digital economies into the largest production network in human history. What began as a trade deal is now reshaping global power itself. As Europe reels from the collapse of its colonial-era advantages, a new reality begins to emerge: a world where Africa and Asia stand shoulder to shoulder, building a trade network that rivals anything the West has ever constructed. This isn't just an agreement on paper. It's a total restructuring of the global supply chain. A $25 trillion alliance uniting over 70% of the world's population and more than half of its mineral resources. In the early days, many dismissed the deal as symbolic. But when African and Asian ministers unveiled the Unified Resource Corridor project, everything changed. It linked African ports like Mombasa, Lagos, and Durban directly with Shanghai, Mumbai, and Dubai using high-speed shipping lanes, AI-driven logistics, and cross-continental digital payment systems. The message was clear. Africa and Asia were no longer waiting for Western approval. They were designing their own future. The alliance is sometimes called the Second Silk Road, a direct reference to the ancient trade route that once connected Africa, Asia, and Europe centuries ago. But this new system is far more advanced, built on 5G logistics, drone freight monitoring, and AI-powered customs networks. In Kenya, port automation increased cargo efficiency by 63%. In Tanzania, new railway lines now link inland mining regions directly to Indian Ocean ports. And in Ethiopia, Chinese and South Korean engineers have co-developed Africa's largest industrial technology park, producing microchips, electric vehicle parts, and advanced batteries for global markets. These projects didn't just improve Africa's infrastructure, they rewired the global economy. Goods that once traveled through European intermediaries now move directly between African and Asian cities in less time and at lower cost. It's a shift of logistics, power, and prestige, and it's erasing centuries of Western dominance over trade routes. For African nations, the goal is simple: self-determination through trade. No more exporting raw minerals just to import finished goods. No more one-sided contracts where profit flows outward. The Africa-Asia Pact includes a built-in resource sovereignty clause, ensuring that every export deal includes local processing and technology transfer. Copper from Zambia is now refined in African smelters co-funded by Singaporean and Indian firms. Cobalt and lithium from the DRC are processed locally before export to Asia's EV industries. This creates millions of jobs, boosts industrialization, and, most importantly, keeps value within the continent. It's an entirely new model of cooperation, mutual benefit instead of extraction. Behind this transformation lies an equally important innovation: a dual currency settlement system jointly developed by African and Asian financial institutions. It allows trade to be conducted in local currencies, bypassing the dollar and euro altogether. Transactions flow through the Pan-African Digital Settlement Network, built on blockchain technology and pegged to commodities like gold and oil. In 2025 alone, this system processed over $4.2 trillion in cross-continental transactions, a number that analysts expect to double by 2026. Global economists call it the most significant shift in international finance since Bretton Woods. For the first time in modern history, the Global South can trade and invest without Western intermediaries. While Africa benefits economically, Asia gains security, access to stable raw materials, energy, and new consumer markets. China deepens its Belt and Road investments, focusing on co-owned infrastructure rather than debt-heavy loans. India expands its manufacturing partnerships with Nigeria and Kenya, positioning itself as a bridge between democracies of the Global South. Meanwhile, ASEAN nations like Indonesia and Malaysia become logistics hubs, managing trade flow between the two continents. Together, this coalition forms what some analysts call the new economic supercontinent. It's not ruled by one ideology or one power, but by shared interests and development goals. In Washington and Brussels, the tone has shifted from skepticism to alarm. Western corporations fear losing dominance in markets they once controlled. Tech giants, from Silicon Valley to Frankfurt, now face competitors backed by entire governments, not startups. The West's monopoly on finance, technology, and production is being challenged simultaneously, and it's coming from nations it once considered developing. The irony isn't lost on observers. For decades, Africa and Asia were portrayed as emerging markets. Now, they are the markets of dominance, the foundation of a new world economy that doesn't revolve around the West. But perhaps the most powerful transformation is psychological. Across African capitals, a new confidence is visible. Trade ministers speak of strategy, not survival. Presidents and economists discuss industrial policy, not dependency. And across Asia, leaders echo the same sentiment. The future is no longer defined by geography or history. It is defined by partnership and parity. The Africa-Asia alliance is not just reshaping trade. It's redefining global power, quietly, efficiently, and irreversibly. As this alliance gains power, the global balance tilts, and Western economies face a reality they can no longer ignore. Africa is no longer a resource to be controlled. It is a power to be reckoned with. The shockwaves from Africa's $25 trillion trade realignment didn't just reach Western markets. They tore through them. For decades, Europe relied on resource access from former colonies to keep its industries alive. When African nations rewrote those contracts under the new trade framework, the consequences were immediate. French industrial output fell to record lows as energy imports became costlier and access to African minerals tightened. By the end of the first fiscal year after the deal, France's trade deficit had doubled. Manufacturers dependent on African raw materials, from car factories to aerospace suppliers, faced supply delays measured in months, not days. What once seemed like minor diplomatic shifts had evolved into a systemic crisis for Western economies built on cheap extraction. For centuries, Western growth depended on a single formula: extract resources cheaply from Africa and Asia, manufacture them in Europe or America, and sell finished goods back at a premium. That cycle created immense wealth, but also deep dependency. Now, the formula has reversed. Africa processes its own minerals. Asia produces advanced technology in partnership with African firms. And the West, for the first time in modern history, is the side waiting to buy. Analysts at the International Trade Observatory described it bluntly. The North-South economic flow has flipped. The global South is no longer the supplier. It's the system. European stock markets reacted violently. Energy indexes in Paris and Frankfurt lost nearly a third of their value in 6 months. Currency traders reported volatility reminiscent of the 2008 financial crisis. The message was clear: the age of unilateral control was over. Among Western nations, France suffered the most. For decades, Paris maintained deep financial influence in West and Central Africa through the CFA franc system, which tied several African economies to the French treasury. But when the Africa-Asia bloc introduced its commodity-backed digital currency, the CFA's role collapsed almost overnight. Within months, participating African countries shifted reserves from the euro to gold and yuan-denominated assets. This move drained France's access to cheap African capital, a loss valued at over $500 billion according to European analysts. Without that leverage, France's geopolitical footprint shrank rapidly. Military withdrawals from the Sahel accelerated, and long-standing diplomatic influence eroded. In global trade circles, France transformed from a gatekeeper to an observer, a nation watching a new world order form without its input. While Europe struggled, Africa's economic map transformed. Countries once known for single commodity exports diversified into manufacturing, logistics, and finance. Nigeria launched the continent's largest oil-to-chemicals conversion complex, reducing its dependency on Western refineries. Ethiopia became a continental aviation and shipping hub linking African and Asian markets. Kenya and Ghana introduced sovereign wealth funds to reinvest export earnings into education and technology. At the same time, Asian investors poured trillions into infrastructure equity instead of loans, meaning Africa kept ownership stakes in ports, railways, and energy grids. This single shift, from debt to equity, may be one of the most significant structural changes in modern economics. The result: a stable trade loop powered by mutual interest, not debt. Western think tanks call it the cooperative model, but in Africa and Asia, it's simply viewed as fair business. Across the Atlantic, the United States faced a strategic puzzle. On one hand, Washington publicly welcomed Africa's growth. On the other, it feared losing global supply dominance in key technologies. Cobalt for batteries, rare earth elements for microchips, lithium for EVs, all increasingly traded outside dollar channels. U.S. industries reliant on these inputs, from semiconductors to renewable energy, now faced higher costs. The dollar's share in global trade settlements slipped from 58% to below 50% for the first time in modern record. American policymakers recognized that sanctions and pressure would backfire. Instead, they began proposing partnerships emphasizing climate technology and green investment, an acknowledgement that influence through cooperation was now the only viable path. Meanwhile, on the ground across Africa, the changes were visible. Brand new industrial corridors ran from Dakar to Nairobi, linked by smart rail systems powered by renewable energy. Data centers operated on locally produced microchips. Solar plants in the Sahel supplied energy to cities once dependent on imported fuel. This quiet revolution wasn't just economic, it was psychological. For the first time in modern history, African nations shaped global policy on their own terms. Their leaders spoke with unity, backed by economic weight. It was no longer about foreign aid or investment conferences. It was about agenda-setting power, the ability to define what global growth looked like. Back in Europe, debate turned inward. How had an entire continent missed the most important shift of the century? Commentators on French and German television admitted what was once unthinkable. Europe's colonial legacy had become its greatest liability. By holding on to outdated systems of control and underestimating African innovation, Europe had priced itself out of the future. Energy shortages led to industrial slowdowns. Inflation surged as imported raw materials became scarce. By 2027, several European economies were officially in recession, while Africa posted the fastest combined growth rate on Earth. What once defined emerging markets had now emerged. When historians look back on this era, they may describe it not as a crisis for the West, but as the birth of balance, the moment when global wealth finally began to reflect global reality. Africa's $25 trillion trade reconfiguration didn't happen overnight. It was decades in the making, the product of policy reforms, inter-regional cooperation, and strategic patience. Asia's participation accelerated it, but Africa's determination anchored it. The lesson is simple yet profound. Economic independence is the truest form of sovereignty. And for the first time in modern history, Africa holds the levers of that sovereignty in its minerals, its markets, its people, and its partnerships. France's collapse is symbolic, the end of an era when Western economies grew by dictating global rules. In the new equation, power isn't concentrated in one capital or one currency. It's distributed across continents that were once ignored. As the narrator's voice fades, one truth becomes impossible to deny. The world no longer moves through Paris or Washington. It moves through Lagos, Nairobi, and Addis Ababa. Africa has not merely entered the global economy. It has redefined it.